Hey budget gardeners, Vita Loca here. Join me today as we winter sow cardinal flower seeds. So let's go. If you've watched many of my winter sowing videos, or if you're very familiar with winter sowing, go ahead and skip to the timestamp shown below. However, if you're new to my videos or new to the winter sowing process, watch this whole video because I go over a lot of important steps involved with winter sowing. Winter sowing is the process of sowing seeds outdoors during the winter months. You can simply scatter the seeds out on the ground, or you can sow the seeds in some sort of a container or pot. When it comes to what kind of container or pot to use, there are so many different choices out there. The big thing is you want to make sure it's translucent or clear. I like to use milk jugs, but I know other people have used juice jugs, rotisserie chicken containers, totes. The possibilities are endless. The big thing is no matter what container you choose, you want to make sure that it can hold at least 4 inches of soil in it. Your containers should have holes in the top to allow water or moisture to come in. The containers should also have holes in the bottom to allow for proper drainage of water. I like to use potting mix. You can use whatever works for you. The key is to make sure that it's well draining and also that it retains some moisture. You don't want to use a seed starting mix because it's too light, too fluffy, and it will dry out way too quickly. You also don't want to use garden soil because it's very heavy and it's too compacted, which makes it difficult for roots to grow in. There are a ton of benefits when it comes to winter sowing. It's very easy to do, it's cheap. It doesn't require any additional equipment. You don't need any grow lights, you don't need any room inside your house. Another benefit to the winter sowing process is that the seeds will get a natural cold stratification period. That's very important for certain seeds such as perennial seeds. And in the end, your seedlings will be stronger, they'll be healthier, and they'll already be hardened off. You don't need to do the whole hardening off process like you would have to do if you started your plants indoors. Now there is a certain timeline that you want to follow when it comes to winter sowing. If you start your seeds too early, there is a chance that those seeds will germinate prematurely, and if you get a cold snap, some of those plants that germinate quickly can die. However, if you start your seeds too late, what will happen is certain seeds, like the ones I talked about earlier that need a certain period of cold stratification time, they might not get that full period of cold stratification that those seeds need. So timing is everything. Now, of course, when it comes to the timing, it's going to vary from location to location. A general guideline is you do your winter sowing sometime starting in the month of December, but you want to be done with it sometime about 2 to 3 weeks before your average last frost date. But I want to give you a more specific timeline that I'm going to be following and that you can follow as well. So about 5 to 6 months before your average last frost date, you want to be sowing seeds that are requiring a cold stratification period. And those are usually perennials that are hardy in your area where you live. About 3 to 4 months before your average last frost date, that's a great time to be starting cold hardy plants. Plants that can tolerate cold, but also plants that reseed very easily in your area. Approximately 1 to 2 months before your average last frost date is a good time to start plants that are not cold hardy, plants that do better in warmer temperatures. Now, keep in mind though that when those seeds germinate, if you are going to have a cold snap, if you're going to have some cold nights, cold days, you want to protect those seedlings. You may need to cover them during that time. You may need to bring in your containers just for a few nights during those cold snaps. Don't be discouraged if you're running out of containers for winter sowing. Even though there are a lot of containers you can use, I prefer to use milk jugs. In fact, one year when I didn't have that many milk jugs, I contacted a local Starbucks. I asked them if they could hold some milk jugs for me. Well, they go through so many milk jugs a day, they were more than happy to hold a few bags for me. So definitely reach out to local coffee shops if you're looking for some sort of containers that are translucent or clear. Some people like to pre-moisten their potting mix, and that is totally fine to do. The reason you won't see me doing it in my winter sowing videos is because it is frozen outside during the months of January and February. So I'm just giving a small amount of water, but then I'm placing the milk jugs outside where they're going to be frozen for a long time. And as soon as the weather warms up, I'll start watering the milk jugs more often. In order to keep your milk jugs from flying around, you can always corral them together and then put some sort of a barrier around them just to keep them together. There are a lot of different options out there. You can use some sort of temporary fencing, you can use some sort of bricks or stones. You can be creative, but just be sure that your milk jugs are not toppling over and blowing around in the wind. Let's get started with a quick plant profile, and then we'll go ahead and winter sow our seeds. Cardinal flower is also known as Lobelia cardinalis. The plant has showy, small, tubular, scarlet red flowers that are an important food source for the hummingbirds. This plant would be a great addition to a hummingbird or butterfly garden. Here's a fun fact for you. The name cardinal flower comes from the bright scarlet robes worn by cardinals in the Catholic religion. The plant is hardy in USDA zones 2 through 9. It's considered a short-lived perennial, but if you want to have this perennial for a long time in your garden, then it's a good idea to sow the seeds either through the winter sowing process, indoor under grow lights, or to scatter the seeds outdoors. You can also divide the plant very easily. It's native in many areas of North America as well as Canada. What I'll do is provide a list of all the areas where this plant is native down below in case you're interested. Bloom time will vary depending on your climate, but it generally blooms summer to fall, and it prefers full sun, especially in the cooler regions, or part sun in the warmer regions. The plant grows between 3 to 4 feet in height, and it really thrives in moist conditions. So if you have a very wet area in your yard, cardinal flower would be a great choice. It also does well in woodland areas, streams, banks, anything that's nice and moist. However, if you do want to add this plant in your garden and there isn't a lot of moisture, you can either add drip irrigation around it, or you can just be sure to water it very frequently. Cardinal flower makes a great cut flower, but just be aware that when you do cut the stems, there will be a milky sap that comes from them. The plant attracts birds, butterflies, and hummingbirds. After all, hummingbirds love the color red, which is no surprise that they are attracted to this plant. All parts of this plant are toxic to humans and pets, so just be aware of that. Even though cardinal flower is deer and rabbit resistant, the animals may browse on this plant if there is no other food source for them. And this plant is mostly free of pests as well as disease. However, the basil plants may get attacked by slugs or snails, so just be aware of that. When sowing the seeds, keep in mind that they need light to germinate. So you just want to press the seeds into the surface of the soil. And if you are going to cover them, just barely cover them about 1/8 of an inch with vermiculite, seed starting mix, or potting mix. The seeds need what's called a cold stratification period of generally 60 days. You can achieve that through the winter sowing process. Just make sure you winter sow your seeds with enough time for them to get that cold period. Or you can put the seeds in your refrigerator for the same period of time of 60 days. If you're going to start your seeds indoors under grow lights, you want to start them anywhere between 6 to 12 months before your average last frost date. If you don't know what your average last frost date is, check out the link below, enter your zip code, and it will give you an estimate of what your average last frost date is. But be sure to check out the map on that page as well, because the map will give you a more accurate average last frost date for you. The seeds should germinate when the soil temperature is around 70 degrees Fahrenheit. If you are starting the seeds indoors and you are in a grow room that doesn't get to that warm of a temperature, you may need to add a heat mat in order to achieve that warm soil temperature of 70 degrees Fahrenheit. The plants will generally flower their first year if started from seed. And if they don't flower that first year, they definitely should flower the second year. So now I'm going to show you my process for winter sowing cardinal flower seeds. I have to tell you, when you collect your own seeds, it's amazing how many seeds you can actually get. Here's a packet of seeds right here, and there are probably hundreds of seeds just in this packet alone. And I couldn't even venture to guess how many seeds are in this packet. Clearly, I don't need that many seeds, so this year I'm only going to be winter sowing 1 milk jug worth, but I'll be packing it with quite a few seeds because the plan is to thin the plants out once they get their first set of true leaves. Down in the description, I'll put a link to a video I made showing you how to collect the seeds from a cardinal flower plant in case you're interested. There are so many different containers you can use for winter sowing, but regardless, no matter what container you're using, always make sure it's a clean container. And you want to be sure no matter what container you're using, it can hold about 4 inches of potting soil. You can see that that goes right around here. So when I make my cut, I want to make sure I'm cutting around here, but I also need this part here. I don't want to cut into it because this will be the handle to open and close my mini greenhouse. I'm going to need something sharp to cut my mini greenhouse or my milk jug. So I'm going to be using these. You can use scissors or anything else that you have. These are just cutting shears or snips that you would use to cut tin. I threw away the cap because I want to leave this part open. Whatever container you use, you want to make sure that you have some sort of holes in the top of it to allow for water like rain or snow to come in here, and that will help keep everything nice and moist inside of your mini greenhouse. And if for whatever reason you're not getting any moisture and things are drying out, you can always add water into this hole as well. I do like to add additional holes in the top here, but that's completely optional. I've been doing it for years and that's worked for me. You also want to add drainage holes in the bottom of your container. That will allow water to come out if there's too much water in here. And it also allows it so if you want to bottom water your container, you can easily do that, because then the water can wick up and it can water the soil and the seedlings that are in here. I always like to add more than less holes in the bottom because I want to make sure that this container has good drainage. And that's all I'm going to add for holes. It's a small container. If this was a much larger container, then maybe I'd add some additional holes in the center here. Now I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to cut my container. Some people like to use a marker and make a line. I'm not going to worry about that. It doesn't need to be a perfect line. I'm just going to start somewhere around here and I'm going to make my way onto the other side. Now I'm going to stop because I don't want to cut all the way through. I want to have an area here and here. And the reason for that is I want to make sure that I'm using the handle as a hinge for my mini greenhouse. And notice they don't perfectly line up, and that is totally okay. Next, I'm going to go ahead and get some potting mix filled into the bottom of this container. I like to use potting mix, not seed starting mix. I find that it's better for holding the water, and also it doesn't dry out as quickly. And I'm actually using potting mix that I made myself, and I'll put a link down in the description below on how to make your own potting mix. It saves a lot of money in the long run. The next thing is to push down lightly, not very hard. I'm trying to eliminate any sort of air pockets that might be in here. But I also don't want to press down too hard because as the plants start growing and their roots are forming, you want to make sure that the roots can grow inside of this potting mix. It's really up to you how many seeds you want to sow in any of your containers. You can see I am heavily sowing these seeds, and I'm okay with that because when it comes time to it, I can either use the hunk of seedling method or I can prick out seedlings individually. And I'm very liberally scattering the seeds on the surface here. When you winter sow seeds, it's very important to always know how deep you need to plant the seeds. A lot of perennials, you can just scatter them on the top and they basically will germinate just fine if you just press them into the soil. And that's called surface sowing. But it's always a good idea to do your research and read specifically about the requirements for each seed that you're planting. This is very similar to what happens in nature. When a plant goes to seed, like the cardinal flower, it will drop its seeds. And no one's there to intervene. And over time, the snow or the rain comes, pushes the seeds into the soil, and then suddenly you have new plants emerging. And that's exactly what we're doing here. The only difference is we're doing it in a more controlled way inside of this milk jug. And when you have little tiny seeds like this, it is very, very hard to limit yourself. And I'm clearly spreading more seeds than I need, and I'm okay with that because you never know which seeds are going to germinate. So it's always better to sow a little bit more than you need to. And in my case, a lot more, because I'm growing these not only for myself, but I'm also going to be growing these for my backyard plant nursery. I grew some last year as well, and those should definitely bloom for me this year. These may bloom, these may not, but it's always good to keep sowing your perennial seeds year after year, especially if you don't have many of the same plant in your landscape. Since the seeds need light to germinate, I'm just pressing the seeds into the soil. I'm making sure that the seeds make good contact with the potting mix. I'm just using a garden marker, and I've created a label, Cardinal Flower, and I'm going to place it on the inside of my container. I like to do that just in case the label on the outside gets worn off. I'm just using this small hand water pump sprayer. You can use whatever you want to water your potting mix as well as your seeds. And I'm giving it just a gentle spray. I don't want to give it a very heavy spray because I don't want to dislodge any of the seeds. And remember, you may need to moisten all of your potting mix. Where I live, as soon as I bring this outside, this is going to freeze, and it's going to stay frozen for days. And there will be some snow and rain that may come inside of here. But the main thing is it will be frozen, so I won't really need to add any more additional water to this, probably for the next month and a half to 2 months. I'm just using a paper towel to wipe the sides because I find it's easier to stick the duct tape onto the container if it's dry. I'm just using duct tape to seal my container shut. I know some people like to punch holes in the top as well as the bottom of their container, and then they like to close it using some sort of a twisty tie or pipe cleaner, and that seems to work well. So use whatever you want to close your container as long as you're able to easily open it on the days when it gets really hot outside, because you don't want to burn your seedlings. But then on the days that it's kind of cold and you need to protect them, you need to be able to close this. Since we're sowing perennial seeds, I'm not too worried about it getting too cold in here. And the reason is these are hardy perennials in my zone. So since I typically winter sow perennials first, December, January, and February, I only add a few pieces of the tape on my container. There's really no use in me adding tape all the way around the container, because even if some cold comes in here, it's not going to kill off these perennial plants once they start germinating. They'll be fine. And they're not going to germinate anyway until the soil conditions are right, and it's usually much later into the spring season. Now, when I start winter sowing plants that are not hardy, say vegetables or annuals that are not hardy in my area, then I may need to add tape all the way around. But I'm not going to worry about it now for my perennials. I've never done this before. I've only added 2 pieces or 3 pieces of tape, and I've always had success. I'm pushing down. I want to make sure that the tape is sticking to my container. I'm going to use my garden marker again, and I'm just going to label what the plant is in here. I used to label it directly on the container itself, but I actually like to reuse my containers. They usually last 2 to 3 seasons. So instead, I now label it on my tape. Some people, instead of putting in the plant name on the tape, they like to number it. So they might put a number 1, and then number 1 on a piece of paper or a spreadsheet would be the plant name. So Rebecca. Number 2 might be lupin. Number 3, foxglove, and so on. So I'm just labeling this with Cardinal Flower. I like to add the label only on the duct tape, not on the container itself, because I've found that I can reuse this container for at least 2, if not 3 years if I take good care of it. This is optional, but I'm going to also label it on the other side. And now I can go ahead and place this out in a full sun area where it can get access to rain and snow through here, and I'll make sure that it's protected from blowing away in the wind. In future videos, I'll give you updates on what the seedlings look like once they've germinated, my process for pricking them out, potting them up, or putting them out in the landscape, as well as fertilizing the plants. If you have Cardinal Flower in your yard, or if you're going to be planting the seeds this year, let me know in the comments below. I'd love to hear from you. And until the next video, make it a great day with gardening.